We are really excited to kick off 2025 with a very interesting speaker. We really thought about what do we say after the election, and Lord knows, if you're like me, you're sick about reading, and everybody is so smart, 2020 hindsight about what went wrong and who voted and what shoulda, coulda, mighta happened and everything like that. So we wanted to take a different take on the election because obviously we have to move forward now, and moving forward means resisting. We can't give up, we can't throw in the towel, and in some ways our work is harder and more important moving forward. But how do we get the energy and inspiration and really develop the strategies that will be effective in resisting? So we decided to invite Scott Matthew, who is he's a professor of history, Dr. Matthew, at FSCJ, and also my neighbor. He's a resident of Atlantic Beach. His lovely family is in the back of the room here to either razz him or provide moral support. But Scott's going to give us some hope, I think, by focusing on people who have resisted successfully in the past. So kind of a historical spin on this. And believe it or not, we're not going to look at history at some far-off place in the country. We're going to look at history and the situation in our own backyard here in Jacksonville. So Scott received his PhD in history from the University of Virginia. He has a very eclectic, I would say, portfolio of interests, all the way from documentary film to African American history and American history. So he comes with a real wealth of knowledge and a real specialization in history of Jacksonville, where we live. As I said, his family's in the back of the room, including his mother, and his wife Meredith, and his daughter Layton, who promised me she wouldn't harass her father. So Scott's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a conversation about some of the things that we learned through his presentation with an eye toward how can we apply this moving forward to the work that we need to do. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you all for coming out on this chilly evening. This is an extraordinarily large turnout. I was not anticipating this. Very grateful for your support, and and I understand there's a sense of a need for camaraderie. And as Carol said, when she told me about this, I thought it was a wonderful idea, but I was really debating about what I wanted to talk about to kind of give a sense of how history can inspire a sense of hope within us during times that seem bleak and dark and insurmountable. And I was thinking globally, I was thinking nationally, and I just thought, really, what is it we have most control over? And that's where we live, at the most basic local level. Just everything that Carol was just explaining that y'all are doing. And I really, the thing with Lutheran social services, that is extraordinary. And that's an example of when the big picture seems just too big, too strenuous, too implacable. What do you have control over? And that goes for our daily lives. Whenever we feel anxious, what do we have control over in our own lives? Well, so I began to think, rather than talking about what happened in interwar Germany or somewhere in West Africa, I'm going to try to bring a story here to Jacksonville. And when thinking about histories of Jacksonville that show citizens trying to overcome insurmountable odds, there's no shortage of stories I could go to. And I decided to focus on one in particular, and if you can't see it, and if you do not know, because I don't believe this is probably too late for Carol to send out to you, my talk this evening is this, and this is a quote Because we are human beings, women's activism in the fight against air pollution in Jacksonville from the 1940s to the 1970s. Now, there were a lot of problems in Jacksonville, in post-World War II Jacksonville, and particularly during the time period I'm going to focus on. I'm going to be focusing in particular on the 60s. You're going to see in just a minute why I'm starting my talk in the 40s and why I'm going to carry it to the 1970s. But I'm really going to be focusing on the 60s because that is when women's activism goes to the forefront and really begins to change the environmental conditions, particularly the air quality in Jacksonville. But in many ways, I want to convey to you before I jump in here that this is just one of many, many problems in the city of Jacksonville in the 60s that seemed really insurmountable. So these are not entirely different from what other cities were experiencing in the United States during this time, particularly in the South. But in addition to the environmental problems in the city that I'm going to touch on in just a bit, of course, in the 1960s, Jacksonville is going through a tumultuous civil rights movement. Most of you are probably familiar with the big events related to the civil rights movement here in Jacksonville, such as Axe Handle Saturday. But in the history of the civil rights movement in Jacksonville, the year 1964 is really the crescendo moment. It is the year that our mayor, Mayor Hayden Burns, the mayor has decided he wants to run for governor. And his attention and his energy is not in Jacksonville with the numerous crises in the city. He has ambition for higher office and is off doing his thing to court voters in Florida so he can make it to the governor's mansion in Tallahassee. That sets a kind of context. There's a void of leadership in the city during the 1960s, in part because this is the second time Mayor Burns has run for governor. The first time is in 1960, he loses. In 64, he runs again and he actually wins. But because he is courting state voters, he's not paying attention to what's going on in the city. In addition to the environmental crisis, you have a growing protest movement. Because in 1964, until July, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed by Lyndon Johnson, Jacksonville remains a deeply segregated city. And Mayor Burns and administration is absolutely opposed to the NAACP, the NAACP Youth Council, to the president of the NAACP, Rutledge Pearson. They are adamant they're not going to give an inch. We are going to maintain segregated businesses downtown, segregated employment. And so what happens is that Rutledge Pearson, the NAACP, black pastors, particularly youth at local junior highs and high schools, they go off and march. Well, what does Mayor Burns do? He calls up the firemen, he deputizes the fire department, and basically said, we're going to get firemen to arrest young protesters downtown because we're going to arrest so many the police can't do it all. In addition to that, Mayor Burns says, oh, by the way, I'm not going to let you protest downtown either. That leads to a violent collision. Many people were very upset with Mayor Burns, and the protests expand, and they get national news. Life magazine covers this. Jacksonville is front and center in a really, really volatile year. 1964 is really the beginning of the urban riots in America that will continue throughout the 1960s. In addition to this, Jacksonville and Duval County in particular, you might know this, in 1964 in November of 1964, Duval County's public high schools are disaccredited. And this is a complex set of reasons, but one, I'll just give you a stat here. In 1964, among the 67 counties in the state of Florida, Duval County ranks last, 67th in per capita funding for public education. So you've got a situation in 1964 where Jacksonville is a city in crisis because it has a void of leadership, because its mayor is more focused on higher office than doing the work of being mayor, and that might set some alarm bells off for you for some other examples. Number two, you have a public education crisis, which is also in effect a kind of civil rights issue and matter. They're really inextricably tied. However, the disaccreditation affects black schools as it does white schools. My mom graduated from Robert E. Lee, which is now Riverside High School, in 1969, and graduated from disaccredited high school, but somehow made it to FSU and did just well for herself. But at the same time, Jacksonville is getting a terrible reputation out across the nation, not only because of what is happening in the city. It has long had a black eye because of its rigid, even violently enforced Jim Crow system. It has long had a bad reputation, really since the post-World War II era, of a collapsing public school system. Jacksonville by the 1960s also has some of the worst air quality in the nation. It is really only second to Los Angeles and Pittsburgh in terms of its air quality. Jacksonville in the 1960s and into the 1970s also has the highest lung cancer death rate in the nation. In addition to that, the St. Johns River, what had once been one of the world's richest ecosystems, the St. Johns River by the 1960s is unfit for life. It is, on a daily basis, seeing millions upon millions upon millions of gallons of sewage that is being dumped into the river, into city creeks, by industries, and even by the city itself. So, when you are looking at the world we live in today, and you're thinking, my God, what are we going to do? Think back to Jacksonville in the 1960s. And I haven't even gotten to the city corruption. City council members who are going to be indicted by a grand jury, and that this is also going to bring national attention, that is going to lead to something called consolidation when city and county governments, in the name of rooting out any kind of corrupt practices, but dealing with a budget shortfall. Jacksonville is also a city on the economic brink in 1964. The 1960s is the decade of increasing white flight out to Duval County. This is white flight in the suburbs. Jacksonville's tax base is shrinking. It already had a small tax base, and it's finding itself in economic peril. And so consolidation was designed to address a lot of these things, including the environmental crisis in this city. But my point here today is that the environmental crisis that will eventually, in a piecemeal fashion, begin to be addressed in the late 1960s into the early 1970s, and this continues to the very present day, would not have happened without the role of, and the activism of women. And we're going to see today both working class women, women from poor neighborhoods, but also women from the elite of old Jacksonville. And that is going to be a kind of coalition that makes this change possible. So where I want to start today is in 1949. I'm going to move this forward, there we go. Oh. Okay, so in 1949, this is something I'm going to use a quote from my colleague. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Tim Gilmore. He is an English professor at FSCJ. He's written a number of fantastic books about interesting moments in Jacksonville history. But Tim also runs a blog about Jacksonville history, and he has written about this. In the moment we begin to see a women's movement for air pollution reform begins in 1949. And this is what Tim calls it. Tim calls it the Great Stocking Rot of 1949, and he, by stockings, is referring to pantyhose. In 1949 and in 1950, Jacksonville got national attention because women walking downtown in Jacksonville in January and February began to feel their legs stinging. And at first, people began to say, is this no-see-ums or sand fleas or mosquitoes? But they were oftentimes in agony. And what they discovered suddenly is that their nylon hose were disintegrating on their legs as they were walking downtown. And this was becoming a crisis. So many were complaining to city officials that word gets out, and national news is coming down to Jacksonville to figure out why women's hose is disintegrating on their bodies. So this is what that national attention looks like. So I'm going to show you these, and I know you might not be able to see the captions here, or the title, and this one is Girls Go Bare-Legged, Nylon Stocking Mystery Still Prevails in Duval County. The caption says, Miss Pat Reel, one of several hundred women victims of a mysterious airborne substance which disintegrated nylons in Jacksonville. Her stockings are shown almost completely ruined. Mrs. Tom Barclay was one of hundreds of women caught in sheer chaos in downtown Jacksonville. Didn't you get that? She took the remains of her stockings off and did as the other women did. It's one of these events that I wish my grandmother was still alive, because she was alive in 1949 in Jacksonville. She was in her 20s, hadn't yet had my mom, but this is something she would have perhaps known about. And I just never got that chance, and I've yet to meet someone who was alive then to express their confirmation of what was happening. So, what happens, of course, here is that the women of Jacksonville obviously are the ones complaining, and they're complaining to the city, and they're complaining to public health officials, and nothing is really getting done. So this is a quote from the AP. This is 1 year, so this is the first one happened in January of 1949. The second great stocking rot happened in January of 1950. And it's interesting, this was happening primarily in January and February. I'll explain why in just a little bit. But the AP a year later, now the fever pitch has gotten high. Women are fed up. The city is doing nothing. This is what the AP said. The ladies got really mad this time and demanded something be done. So the city commission met and they decided on this action. The fire department would flush the downtown streets in an experiment to see if the water will do any good to keep down the hose-hungry fumes and the ladies' tempers. Well, by that point, it was already known. It was actually known the year before what was causing the disintegration of these nylon stockings. It was sulfuric acid. It was sulfuric acid that was coming out of new chemical plants and container plants, such as the National Container Corporation Mill. This is a photograph of Jacksonville in 1949, and this is the National Container Mill in the 1940s and 1950s. But it was also coming from city-owned electricity generating stations. And the city knew that, and yet the women were being, in some sense, patronized, not for the last time, by just this sort of what we would call today performative act. Let's just get the hose and spray it down, and maybe that was the water that was splashing on their legs that had some chemicals in it. But in fact, what was known is that Jacksonville had a sulfuric acid problem, and it would be one that will persist well into the 60s. And it's going to take women getting involved to eventually bring this to the nation's attention. So, despite the great stocking rot, Jacksonville's air quality worsens throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. And let me just give you a sense of why. First off, Jacksonville's population by the 1950s and 1960s is actually kind of stagnating. By 1964, Jacksonville's population had hit about 200,000, was actually beginning to go down for reasons I've already said. White flight into the suburbs. So the city's population is declining, but the metro area is growing, and is growing rapidly. At the same time, we're seeing new businesses coming in. We are seeing paper plants, glass plants, chemical plants. They are lining up and down the St. Johns River. No problem. I factor in time almost for phones at this point. So, though the population is stagnated, business is moving in great droves, and this is in part because the city is luring in businesses with promises of low taxes. And this tension between community health and low taxes is going to be a very common theme. We've already seen it with public schools. Why did Duval County rank 67th out of 67 counties? As the Florida Times Union said, Duval County citizens were selfish. They did not want to pay taxes to support the public school system. They were more concerned about paying no property taxes. And so that tension was here with Jacksonville saying, well, we need to lure business, and at all cost. And we're going to see that this will come at the cost of community health as well. So by the 1950s, Jacksonville has worsening air quality. Respiratory diseases become the most common disease in Jacksonville, and lung cancer death rates are continuing to rise, as I said. By the 1960s and 1970s, Jacksonville will have the highest lung cancer rate in the nation. By the late 1950s, between 30 and 50% of the days, and this will depend upon the year, between 30 and 50% of the days in Jacksonville have the skyline blighted by smog or soot. Now, I mentioned the issue with nylon hose disintegrating and typically doing so in the winter, and this is because in the winter, Jacksonville, like many other places, often had a temperature inversion. And really, I'm not going to get into the meteorology behind this, but typically during the winter, big high-pressure systems will settle over us. When you have a high-pressure system, the air sinks, and when the air sinks, it warms. And when it warms, it creates a cap so that the air basically gets trapped. And so Jacksonville's really bad air pollution was really year-round, but the worst of it tended to concentrate in the winter months. And so those were the winter months when you would see the skyline oftentimes obscured. Well, it is during the late 1950s and during the early 1960s in particular that this becomes even more of a dire issue. And particularly in areas along the St. Johns River that are today the neighborhoods of the East Side, Talleyrand, Panama Park, and then across the river on the east side of the river in Arlington. And that is because there are new plants like the Owens, Illinois Mill that are emitting vast amounts of sulfuric acid and other harmful chemicals into the air. And once again, by the early 1960s, Jacksonville is making national news because there are mass vegetation kills in those neighborhoods. But equally important is that the public health crisis has reached a whole new level. Many of these plants are emitting soot that is making its way into the homes of people who live in these neighborhoods. It is ruining and destroying their cars. Their homes not only are being infiltrated by this soot, but the paint on their houses is being corroded. Their trees, their vegetation are beginning to die off. And so what we begin to see in the early 1960s, as more and more plants begin to grow up here along the St. Johns River, is that people living in these communities, and these communities are working class, both black and white, many people living in these communities begin to speak out in a growing swell of voices. Now, the times when they have begun to raise their voices, a common refrain begins to be heard. And this is one that's going to be repeated again and again and again. So, in 1958 and 1959, we begin to see some Jacksonville women appealing to elected officials for the first time. To city council, but also to state elected officials, such as State Senator Fletcher Morgan, who represented Duval County. Well, what did Fletcher Morgan say? Ironically, he was the chair of the Public Health Committee in Tallahassee, and nevertheless, he opposed any legislation to curb pollution, and he said, "Industry smells good to us in Florida." And eventually, y'all who might have lived here in the 70s and 80s perhaps remember Prime Osborne, who said, the odor we smell in Jacksonville is the smell of money. This becomes that the very pushback they're oftentimes are going to get are from entrenched business interests. And this is going to be one of the really fascinating dynamics, that women are going to be entering into the world of business, in which they've effectively been still excluded in the 1960s, in the realm of politics, which in Florida and Jacksonville, they've effectively been excluded. We need to remember it's not until the election in 1967 that Jacksonville elects its first 2 women to the city council. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. So we can already begin to see at the state level the resistance that many women are going to face. But here in Jacksonville, and here's Prime Osborne. I forgot to, this is his quote. If y'all remember, Prime Osborne was a really incredible civic steward in Jacksonville. So I don't want to leave this as his lasting legacy. But it is nevertheless true. This is sort of the phrase that haunted him for a long time as the CSX board chair. To me, the odor here in Jacksonville smells like money. The air pollution problem in Jacksonville was one not just of the harmful effects of sulfuric acid and chemicals in the air, and the physical effects that that had in the destruction of property and vegetation. Jacksonville would, well into the 1990s, sort of have this just black eye because of its odor problem. That you could smell Jacksonville before you got to Jacksonville. People could smell it in airplanes over JIA before they landed. So this is a problem, as I'm going to finish up, does not end in the 1970s. It continues, but nevertheless, it is a growing problem during this time. So the first woman I'm going to highlight tonight is a woman named Ann Belcher, and I wish I knew more about her. All I really know is that she was a working class woman from Jacksonville. She lived in the Talleyrand neighborhood. So just to orient you here, this is a Google map. This is the Matthews Bridge. This is where the Alltel Stadium is. This is, you go north on the Haines Street Expressway. This is the east side, Fairfield. When you get north of the Haines Street Expressway, you're in Talleyrand. So these neighborhoods, of course, were segregated. The east side was a black neighborhood, as was Fairfield. You get north of that, Talleyrand was a white neighborhood. Panama Park was a white neighborhood. What we're going to find here is that in the midst of the civil rights movement in a deeply segregated city, the environmental issue is actually going to bring people together in a kind of interracial coalition. An imperfect one, but nevertheless an interracial coalition. And it's going to be because of what Ann Belcher does. Ann Belcher walks all around Talleyrand. She walks down into the east side, goes and talks to black citizens there, and gets them to sign a petition. 1,000 names she gets in a petition of people whose lives have been detrimentally affected by air quality. And not only does she get them to sign this petition, she organizes them and gets black people to go with her to the city council meeting where everything in the city facilities are still segregated. They are going in together to force the city council to finally do something. So now let me tell you a little bit about what Ann Belcher did. Let me make sure I'm getting, okay, yes. So Ann Belcher first went to the city council, and she had a number of people speak to the city council to kind of hear personally what they were going through. A woman named Edna Taylor, a white woman, told about how she had to buy oxygen for her husband who was suffering from emphysema, and without that oxygen, her husband was likely to die, and this was only an issue when they moved into the Talleyrand neighborhood. A black man named Ulysses Cook, who lived in the east side, talked about how his son, who suffered from asthma, was very close to death, and that they were considering having to leave unless the city did something. One city council member stood up and said, "It is a wonder half the people in these neighborhoods are not dead," and yet told the women and the others who were there that day, "There is nothing we can do for you." So there was an acknowledgement by the city that this was a problem. You could not deny it. They brought in dead flowers. They even drove corroded cars and parked them outside of City Hall. They brought family members in who were struggling to breathe. The city council heard and saw it, and yet turned around and said, "Though this is clearly dire, there's nothing we can do. Maybe you should just file a lawsuit against Owens, Illinois Plant Company, and that's the only way we can see you solving this, because we don't have the resources to do anything." So if they weren't hearing that this is a problem, from someone like Fletcher Morgan, who was saying, "Well, we like the smell of industry in Northeast Florida," they were hearing a kind of, well, shrugging their shoulders, "What do you expect us to do? We don't have the resources to do anything." So what Ann Belcher did is she said, "Okay, well, I'm going to write my governor. I'm going to write Governor Ferris Bryant. I'm going to move up the chain here. I've talked to Fletcher Morgan. I've talked to the city council. Real quick, this is from the Jacksonville Journal. Jacksonville used to have 2 newspapers, and Jacksonville Journal was the daily paper. This is Ann Belcher. She was known as the crusading mother from Talleyrand. This is the best picture I was able to find of her, the only one, but that is just a sense of the kind of newspaper coverage this women's movement was starting to get here in Jacksonville. So Ann Belcher and her neighbor, Dorothy McGuffey, they decided to say, okay, well, Jacksonville City Council is not going to do anything. We're going to write the governor. We're also going to write a senator, Senator Ed Muskie, a Democrat from Maine. He was on the Senate subcommittee for air and water pollution in 1964. So this is a working class woman who has an elementary education, who is turning now and saying, I'm going to make my voice heard one way or the other. I'm going directly to where I think I can be heard. So she writes a letter, a joint letter. It's the same letter that she writes to Bryant as to Muskie. And this is what Belcher said. All the people on our petition, those 1,000 names, are working class people or retirees. We can't afford to keep replacing things that are being destroyed. This petition was carried to the mayor's office, Mayor Hayden Burns in Jacksonville. Mayor Burns sat up there like his mind was a million miles away. I doubt if he heard a word that was being said. We have attended all the meetings. We carried our dead flowers, our ruined clothes, our rusted out cars to each meeting, but all we got shifted was to yet another meeting. Again, remember what I said at the beginning, Mayor Hayden Burns is running for governor in 1964. So what she is saying about Burns is not dissimilar from what the president of the NAACP at the time, Rutledge Pearson, is saying about Mayor Burns. He won't negotiate anything. He wants to appear tough on civil rights, strong segregationists. That's his view of how to get elected. In negotiating clean air in Jacksonville, well, that's not going to be a winning issue in a campaign for the governorship. So Mayor Burns is of no help either, and they don't get any response or any effective response from Bryant or Muskie either. Unfortunately, but that will change as we're going to see. Okay, so moving on now, what is unclear to me, and this is an issue that I still hope to research a little bit more. So the letter that Belcher writes to Bryant and Muskie is 1964. There's a little bit of a gap in time here where not a lot is happening. It seems like they've just run up against a roadblock and there is nothing they can do except endure what they're going through. This changes in 1967 because of the role of another woman, a woman named Mildred Mimi Adams. If there is one woman that plays an outsized role in improving the environmental conditions, specifically the air quality in Jacksonville in the 1960s, but specifically by the 1970s, it is her. And it's an instructive, sort of, and somewhat unfortunate story. A remarkable woman. But it is going to be because she comes from an elite background. She is from the elite of Jacksonville, from the Stockton family. So because she comes from this elite background, because she is a native-born Jacksonville resident from the Stockton family, she's not an outsider, she is the ultimate insider. She is going to be able to speak with an authority and a voice that Ann Belcher and Dorothy McGuffey could never have had. They provided the foundation. But what this movement suggests to us is that oftentimes an effective grassroots movement needs to be born from the people, of course, but it oftentimes needs to be cross-class. Issues that affect oftentimes the poor do have a voice, and the marginalized do have a voice, but oftentimes, particularly in the context of 1960s Jacksonville, when politics was very insular. It was controlled by the notorious good old boy system. You were not breaking through that wall unless you had the pedigree and background of a Mimi Adams. And she used that to really important ends. So let me talk a little bit about exactly what she did. One Florida newspaper called her, quote, the spunky housewife. And she, along with Ann Belcher and Dorothy McGuffey are going to face constant patronizing interactions with not only politicians, but the press as well. Now, why did Mimi Adams get involved in the environmental movement in Jacksonville? Well, she was a mother of three. One of her children had asthma, and she believed that the air quality in Jacksonville is making her child's asthma worse. She also had a very close friend whose child died from asthma. And what they did in the early 1960s was to form a group called Help Our Asthmatic Children, HOAC. In addition to that, Mimi Adams was something of an intellectual, and you kind of get the sense that had she been born maybe at a different time under a different context, she would have probably been a scientist, maybe someone like Rachel Carson, maybe even an academic of some kind. A lawyer, an environmental lawyer, as the Zizzers are up here. So what she does, though, is read voluminous studies on air quality that were conducted in Jacksonville in the 1960s, but also throughout the state of Florida. What's happening in Jacksonville is also happening in other cities in Florida, even though Jacksonville's environmental problems are orders of magnitude worse than other cities. So she is very well versed in the scientific literature, but she has also done her homework about what is going on in the industries in Jacksonville. And so she spends an incredible amount of time educating herself. And what she discovers in Jacksonville is that the worst offender for air quality is obviously sulfur dioxide, sulfuric acid, but it is more importantly city-generated electric facilities, city-owned electric generating facilities that many people thought it was Owens, Illinois, and St. Regis and other companies that were the primary offenders. They were, but just to give you a sense of the distinction here, during the 1960s, city-owned electric stations released 100 tons of sulfur dioxide every day.
Oh my God.
This is 100 tons of sulfur dioxide every day, and this is in addition. Now we have to keep in mind these businesses, including city-owned facilities, are also dumping millions upon millions of gallons of waste into the St. Johns River. So that's just the city-owned electric generating stations. All other industries combined in Jacksonville in the 1960s released 31 tons of sulfur dioxide every day. So if you combine all the other industries, city-owned electric generating stations still well more than double what these industries. So it is a city of Jacksonville problem, and this is what Mimi Adams eventually realizes. When the main offender is the city, how do you get the city to change? What incentive does the city have to change? Because the other thing she finds out that is really, really important is that the reason why Jacksonville's air quality is so bad is that for 61 years, so going back to 1906, Jacksonville has used the same oil company to get its oil. And it has done so without getting competitive bids. It just has a sweetheart deal with this oil company, and it is very cheap, low quality oil with a very high percentage of sulfur in it. So Mimi Adams, with this information, goes to the city and begins to speak with city leaders. And she can get a special meeting with city leaders because of her background and her family name. And they begin to tell her that, look, Mrs. Adams, the problem here is that what you're proposing, and she's proposing we switch from this bad oil to good, clean gas. Well, the city tells her that's going to be impossible. First and foremost, if we got gas, it's going to be 3 times as much. The bills for all citizens will go up, and the citizens wouldn't want this, and that's just impossible. Well, Mimi Adams had done her homework, and she had talked to gas companies and talked to residents in cities that used this gas company, and they all paid energy costs that were lower than Jacksonville. So she caught them flat-footed. And it was an unimpeachable argument. And so what she then found from that was they had no recourse other than intimidation. And suddenly, despite her name, she was getting phone calls in the middle of the night, telling her to be careful, to watch what she's saying. She really had to reflect about how much further she would go. She at times felt as though her life could be in danger, merely for speaking truth to power in this regard. And again, this is Mimi Adams. This isn't Ann Belcher. This is someone who would have thought that she had some degree of kind of protection from this harassment, although that continued very much. So what did she do? Well, she didn't quit fighting. What she did was continue to go to other women's groups. She clearly understood that women were going to be most receptive to this argument. They were going to be the ones perhaps that had the least ties to business, that maybe if she spoke to women's groups, those women could go home and maybe preach the gospel to their husbands if they were lucky. So what does she do? She goes to the Junior League, and she speaks to the Junior League, and the Junior League is fully behind her. She goes to the League of Women Voters in Jacksonville, and the League of Women Voters is fully behind her. It becomes really an important support network for her. And so in this time of intimidation, she is really fortified by the Junior League and the League of Women's Voters in Jacksonville. And this is something that really begins to happen at the very same time, and that is the city of Jacksonville and Duval counties consolidate. I'm not going to get into the long, complicated history of that, but suffice to say, after consolidation, well, before consolidation, but then during and then after consolidation, a new mayoral administration comes in, and that is Mayor Hans Tanzler. And it is Mayor Hans Tanzler who has a very different vision for Jacksonville. I've already shown that image, so we continue to move on. I'll explain Senator Jennings Randolph in just a little bit, but here's Mayor Hans Tanzler, and it is Hans, not Hans. Mayor Tanzler was concerned about not only improving city government in Jacksonville, but cleaning up the St. Johns River and addressing our air quality problem. Yes, exactly. I think I have an image of Mayor Tanzler skiing in the St. Johns River in the 1970s. But Mayor Hans Tanzler created a brand new air quality committee, and he named Mimi Adams chair.
I was on it.
You were on that. Elliot, sister, you were on it?
For 10 years I was on the Environmental Protection Board.
Wow.
And was told at my confirmation hearing by Councilman David Harrell that it was the smell of money.
So you've heard all that before.
I've heard that, and right now I'm drawing a blank on our most famous mayor after Hans,
Jake Gobble, yeah.
And he echoed David Harrell.
Yes, as a TU cartoon will show here in just a second.
Right.
So Hans Tanzler names Mimi Adams as the chair of this first city air quality or air pollution committee. And in that role, she is chosen to speak before a Senate hearing that is held in Jacksonville in 1969. So the U.S. Senate holds hearings all across the country during 1969 addressing issues of air and water quality. So of course it's going to lead the next year to legislation that I'll touch on in just a second. So Mimi Adams has gone from this woman who starts this group for mothers with asthmatic children to doing voluminous research on her own, going confronting city officials about the environmental quality here in Jacksonville, specifically the air quality and the role of city generating stations in creating this terrible air quality conditions, facing harassment, even death threats, and now she is chosen to speak at this Senate hearing in Jacksonville in 1969. And this is what she says. I'm just going to focus on a couple of things. But she starts off by saying Jacksonville in 1969 is the world's largest free city. Now, of course, it is the largest city land area-wise at that time because of consolidation. And when she said free city, she was partly referencing the context of the Cold War. We are the largest free city in a non-communist country. But I also think she was being a little ironic. And that is, Jacksonville liked to tout itself as the free city, not unlike how we hear today that we are the free state of Florida. And that is because Jacksonville had a deeply, deeply ingrained resistance to federal government oversight fierce resistance to the civil rights movement. Don't tell us to integrate our schools. Don't tell us to integrate our lunch counters. Local control, resistance to taxation. We need to remember many Jacksonville residents were deeply suspicious of consolidation because it resembled a kind of a consolidation of power, a sort of unitary power where there once had been dispersed. Now we're creating one single government. That seems to perhaps trample on our rights as citizens. And so what Mimi Adams is saying is that we hear a lot about freedom in Jacksonville, but what about the freedom of people like the children who are struggling to breathe, or the women like Ann Belcher whose property is being ruined by bad air quality? What about the freedom that we have as a community to breathe clean air? And so she was trying to get the community to think in terms of a different kind of freedom. And so her heart of her testimony, and I won't go back over it because in a sense you've already heard it, the heart of her testimony is that Jacksonville, the city itself, is the prime culprit. But that Jacksonville is not alone. We are just one city in this vast nation. That yes, we may have the highest rate of sulfur dioxide in the nation, other than a city in Texas called Sulphur City. And that is true. We may be not at the very top, only second to Sulphur City, but we are not alone in what we are doing here in Jacksonville, and we've already seen local policies enacted that are beginning to change things. But what happens in one city can't affect what happens in all cities. That we need city legislation, we need state legislation, but we also need national legislation. We are a national community, and indeed, as she says, we are a human community. And this is what she says at the very end of her speech to the Senate subcommittee and to specifically Senator Jennings Randolph, Democrat from West Virginia, who was chairing this hearing in Jacksonville. This is what Mimi Adams said. Our population owes it to itself to become enlightened on such issues as air pollution, so that at election time, men of courage will fill positions of leadership in our government. If these positions are filled by puppets of selfish lobbies, our country shall return to the dark ages. We have only a limited amount of air around our planet. We must work together for the survival to ensure that mankind itself does not become another vanishing species. There was a resounding applause, so loud that Senator Jennings felt obliged to enter into the record. This is not a disturbance, this is just approval. Mimi Adams was followed, and I'm going to near my close here. She was followed by two women from the League of Women's Voters in Jacksonville. The newspaper only gave their names as Mrs. Paul Hayes and Mrs. James Powers. I really tried to figure out their actual given names, but I could not. So Mrs. Hayes got up and said this to the senator. And this is really important because Mimi Adams spoke about this. The absolute terror she felt the first time she went and spoke with the city council in Jacksonville and then to other state elected officials. This was not something you did. And so Mrs. Hayes expresses something similar. She says to Senator Randolph and the other members of the committee, "I have been terrified. My digestion has been upset for a week, just the thought of testifying before you, and that's been the case even knowing that the League of Women Voters would be behind me. But for years, Senator, Mimi Adams has stood alone in this community. Not entirely true, but close. She was ignored at first, then she was ridiculed. She received threats. When she let the word out that she was addressing the Junior League, an employee of the Electric Authority called her and told her she'd better not talk about air pollution. She said she was going to do so anyway. He said, well, if you do that, don't talk about natural gas. But she did so anyway. And the Junior League supported her, and the League of Women Voters supported her, and some health officials even supported her. So she was no longer alone. When legislators vote on these issues, I hope you will remember the Mimi Adamses of this world, because she stands to gain nothing financially, and her sacrifice of time and energy and money should be weighed against special interests of industry who stand to make a great fortune at public expense. And then she finished. I might suggest we put up a statue to Mimi, but I'm afraid at our corrosion rate it wouldn't last. They didn't indicate applause or laughter for that one, but I have to believe. So what happens? Well, what happens 1 year later? both nationally and locally. 1 year later, and many of you are probably alive, December of 1970, the New Clean Air Act was passed. That same month, and of course this is during the Nixon administration, the Environmental Protection Agency is created. So I'm not saying what happened in Jacksonville or Mimi Adams is responsible, but this is the kind of context in which she operated. And that it was the voices of people like Mimi Adams and Ann Belcher and others who in some sense raised this to such a public issue that change at the federal level did happen. And so here's another example of how a grassroots movement against something that seems insurmountable in ways that we can sometimes not anticipate or imagine does bring about change. The civil rights movement is the primary and oftentimes most visible example of that during the 50s and 60s, but I would put the environmental movement up there as well. So locally, what happens? Well, 1 year later, 1971, because of Mimi Adams's work, direct work on the Clean Air Committee in Jacksonville, they shut down a chemical plant in Jacksonville, the Wilson Tumor Fertilizer Company, a massive manufacturer of sulfuric acid. They are closed down because of Mimi Adams's work. So July 1971, they're shut down. In 1971, JEA shifts not to natural gas, but to an oil fuel with a far lower percentage of sulfur. And it has immediate effects on the air quality in Jacksonville. So Mimi Adams's great cause of getting them to shift to natural gas doesn't happen, but the cleaner oil fuel that they're using has immediate effects. And I don't know what this entirely means, but in 1977, Jacksonville was one out of 107, quote, non-oxidant attainment areas of the nation. That sounds important, sounds like an achievement. I'm sure there are more than 107 areas, whatever that means, but that was something that the city touted. Now, sadly, this story for Mimi Adams ends in 1971. In November of 1971, she and her husband, I forgot to mention, if you saw a drawing up there, you were wondering why on earth is there an artistic drawing. Her husband was named Lee Adams. He was an extraordinary artist, someone on, not dissimilar from a John Audubon or a William Bartram, who did extraordinary drawings and paintings of the natural flora and fauna of Florida. A man who also had deep roots in Jacksonville. Well, tragically, they were driving down Roosevelt Boulevard in 1971 and got in a car accident, and both were killed. So her activism, her life ends in 1971, but an environmental award in her and her husband's name is still ongoing. And I oftentimes find this really just beautiful. St. Regis Paper Company, for a long time, and though they won this award in 1974, would continue to be a contributor to the terrible smells and air quality in Jacksonville. Yet, nevertheless, they won an award here. They won specifically the Mimi and Lee Adams Environmental Award for their job in reducing waste and specifically where they dumped their waste. So there was at least some of Mimi Adams's work lives on in this award and how it's given out each year. The last thing I'll point out here is that this should not suggest, of course, this is the end of the environmental movement. This is a movement that goes on. It will go on throughout the 1980s into the 1990s. It continues, of course, today. But the major thing that it will follow, the air quality fight of the 60s, and into the early 1970s will be the odor. And Elliot Sisser was talking a minute ago about Jake Godboll. This is a cartoon from the Florida Times-Union about how city officials were sort of in denial about the poor air quality in Jacksonville. And going back to Prime Osborne's quote, that oftentimes they were putting business and money ahead of the well-being of the city and its environment. So it's, Jake, I think, was a very good mayor all told, but it's not going to be until the administration of Tommy Azzurri in the 1980s. But I'll just point out here, and I'll leave you with this. This is another photograph of a group of community members led by women from Arlington, once again leading the fight against odor quality in Jacksonville. And so you can kind of follow this like a red thread throughout the 20th century. This is a woman named Jean Oster. They lived across from the seminal Kraft pulp mill along the St. Johns River. The owner of that mill, Frank Lee, said, "It's not a bad smell, it's a kind of aromatic sweet type thing." Whereas Jean Oster said it smelled like being trapped inside a porta potty at a carnival. It was an awful smell. There were some really fantastic descriptions. As she says, it feels like, or I should say, it smells like being locked up in a portalette at the county fair. There is no escape. So, again, I just wanted to highlight this. I'm ending with Mimi Adams, but this is a story that continues, and it's a legacy that she left behind. She, Ann Belcher, Dorothy McGuffey, that women, but also men and others picked up in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I hope you will see this as something that, looking back, particularly for those women, seemed insurmountable, impossible to ever change, and yet they did so in ways that are remarkable and that we continue to benefit from today. Thank you.
Do you want to take some questions, Scott, or any observations?
Sure, I know I ran a little late, so if you do have questions, I'll be happy to answer them, but if it's late, I totally understand that too.
I think one of the messages for me is that we could change the names and the problems, but a lot of this rings true today.
It does. It's a case where present and past rhyme. We can never kind of just see the past in identical terms to the present, but there are structures that remain in place that create these resonances that do very much strike us as very familiar.
But also hope inspired by collective action.
Absolutely.
People who don't think they can make a difference. So
No, I mean,
only inspired by that.
and if you combine with what was happening in the civil rights movement in Jacksonville, people literally giving their lives, it's a whole other magnitude of sacrifice. Yeah, Caroline, I thought you.
Yeah, so what do we do now? I heard you mention the Environmental Protection Act.
Right.
So now with our new president going into office and putting individuals who see life his way
Right.
in the EPA, what do we do to make sure that there isn't, what can we do to make sure there's not a huge rollback
Right.
going back 30 or 40 years?
Well, I don't know if I'm the one to answer that. I will just say, as an historian, and again, for those of y'all who were alive in 1968 when Richard Nixon was
Yes.
elected, exactly. Richard Nixon obviously was a Republican, and under a Republican administration we get the Environmental Protection Agency. Well, we're now dealing with a very, very different Republican Party, and now a party that is coming, or administration coming in office would like to do away with it completely.
Yes.
So the dynamic here is totally different. It had to happen. It wouldn't have been the time. So I think that it redoubles the importance of community activism. That it in fact has to begin. The foundation has to begin at the absolute local level. But beyond that sort of philosophy about social movements, which I see as inherently, ideally based at the grassroots amongst the people most affected, how do you then build on that and grow that and scale it to a state level, then to a national level? At this moment in time, I don't know if I have the answers. I'm an historian. I'm not a politician. That's a discussion that I hope people will have. I don't know if I have the answers myself.
At our next meeting.
Yes, to which I would then attend, so I know what to do. Here and then back.
I've lived here off and on since 1958, and having someone who's a historian of this area makes me want to ask this question. It probably is another hour lecture, but if you could kind of succinctly tell me, why is Jacksonville incapable of revitalizing its downtown? This area, like 8,000 we other cities are, when we have this beautiful river.
Yeah.
And what is wrong with us? Why can't we do it?
Man, that is a conversation for a total. But I mean, part of what the Chancellor administration did, what consolidation was in part designed to do, was to improve the quality of the river, which would, of course, bring people not only to the river, but kind of showcase the river so that it would be, you know, the center of entertainment and commerce, and that would then lure business and then residents into the city itself. So in some sense, the environmental history of the St. Johns River, and I would argue the air quality as well, has been historically tied to the need to help downtown improve. That you could not have a vital downtown without a clean river. You could not have a vital downtown with clean air. And these are things that are relatively recent achievements, so to speak. But yeah, the issue with downtown development is a whole other political issue that I don't think anyone wants to get into. But you know, what I will say is that I think Jacksonville has struggled for a very long time with, it had a leadership problem in some sense. And I think if we kind of, and that's another complex answer of why there has been a leadership void. Hayden Burns is always my case study number one for that. But he is not alone. So, yes.
I really appreciate your synopsis of all of this, and this is a beautiful example of how we can potentially gain power in our voice going forward. Yeah. The two things that I heard out of your unspoken things out of your commentary was, it's like the adage of eating an elephant one bite at a time.
Right.
It's got to become a small bite. You can't fight the big fight at first. And as Mimi's example, what I heard you saying was it was factual based.
Yes.
It was not opinion. It wasn't argumentative. It wasn't anything about, except I'm giving you the facts.
Yes.
And the facts are indisputable.
And I agree. And what the one thing that strikes me, because I've reflected on that, and I wonder though today, in a world where there are utterly two different visions of what is real and what is reality and what is factual, that if she presented this evidence today and you had skeptics on the other side who just simply would not believe it regardless of what she put in front of them. And in fact, the mere act of putting evidence in front of one person suggests that they become even more entrenched in their own views. So when you're then addressing a dynamic where there can be no shared reality on the basis of fact, and this I should point out is not new. I mean, I'm telling my students right now during Reconstruction, Americans could not agree about whether or not the Ku Klux Klan was committing violence. There was a whole half of America who said it's a fraud, it's a made-up hoax, it's not actually happening. So oftentimes when you have an ideology, and that ideology is so deeply rooted so that it becomes your very identity, facts don't permeate. Facts just become another volley at your ego that you want to do away with. And so ultimately, I don't know the answer to how to overcome that. I don't think any of us do. And I think that's where our democracy is in such great danger, is over the very nature of what is real. And those are, in some sense, that has always been the case, but I think it's exacerbated for all the reasons you know. I don't need to tell you what those are. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on Carol Brady,
Mm-hmm.
grassroots,
Yeah.
that's how we got civil rights.
Yeah.
That's how we stopped the Vietnam War.
Right.
And then we can do that.
Yeah.
We have to stick together.
Yeah.
to make it happen.
Yeah, no, I mean, I sometimes I think, well, I often say, why did I become an historian? And it was because I remember being in high school and picking up a couple of different books. When I probably should have been studying for work that had been assigned to me, I was reading history books that I just wanted to read because I was interested in the topics. But one of them was the history of the civil rights movement in Mississippi and the grassroots work that Mississippians, but also people associated with a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee did, going door to door to simply educate people about voting. They lived in a state in particular where just going to register to vote could cost you your life. And that groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee went into these communities, they lived with the people, they went to church with them, they had dinner with them, they were willing to put their bodies on the line, or even die in order so that someone could vote. That had such a profound impact on me. And I began to, at that very same time, read books about the abolitionist movement that effectively began as a kind of grassroots movement. The national government had no interest in using its power to end slavery, so it was inherently a grassroots movement growing up among enslaved people from churches at that time. And that so moved me that I went to a college in North Carolina called Guilford College, which is a Quaker school. And the examples of Quakers in the peace movement, organizing peace movements, the Quakers were instrumental in the Underground Railroad. Quakers established Guilford College as a way to make sure that Quaker children did not get brainwashed by an ideology that said slavery was a good thing, a paternalistic, civilizing institution. And they used education to instill that slavery was contrary to the will of God and an evil. And that had a profound impact on me. And so that's another example when I was trying to think about what to talk about tonight. I continue to go back to history. History is full of dark passages, as we all know, but within that darkness, there are elements of light that pop up. And this is just one, Mimi Adams, Ann Belcher, and Dorothy McGuffey. So this is an appeal to use history as a kind of base for ideas, for inspiration, because it is waiting there to be kind of uncovered. And during the past 8 years, 10 years, history has been sort of that foundation, that constant. It is always an opportunity to learn and to think anew by people who have already done it before. We're not inventing anything. It has already been done. It's us to then pick up that mantle, pick up that torch. All right, thank you.